Thank you very much, Maria, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to provide this webinar for you today. So let's talk a little bit about what we hope to see this afternoon. We will discuss what is resource management, what is it in general terms, and what problems are we trying to solve. Then we'll look a bit more specifically in terms of our resource management solution. How does it work? What are the things you need to be aware of? And also, more technically, for those experienced users of our software, how would you actually start about setting this up and using it? And then finally, we'll finish with a brief demonstration of some of the capabilities, and at the end we will be happy to answer as many of your questions as possible. So let's talk a little bit about resource management in general. The reality is that very little within the original plan will survive intact for the duration of the project. The requirements will change, and rarely will they be reduced. Tasks overrun, resources will be reallocated elsewhere, and maybe even replaced with less capable alternatives while team members fall ill or have unexpected commitments. There is, however, very little chance the delivery date can be moved. So the project manager is faced with a constant rebalancing of tasks and resources while desperately trying to understand whether the delivery date is still achievable and guaranteeing the necessary quality in the application. So spreadsheets can work, but with these complex challenges they can be a poor fit, and project management tools have traditionally focused on the task definition and management without fully embracing the key aspects of resource and quality. So what do we need? What we need is total visibility of a single project, of all projects, for the manager so that he can complete his daily and wide-ranging tasks. So resource management answers some very important questions. Questions such as, how many resources do I need? What is my predicted completion date? And do I need to make any changes to my plan to achieve my goals? It provides an overall high-level view of a project or of all projects with the ability to drill down into the detail and make adjustments as necessary. It also allows you to see immediately the results of any corrective action. So, for example, if I had another resource, what is my new predicted completion date? Or if somebody goes on holiday, how does that affect my project? We can also see at a glance and at a resource level, is each resource over or underutilized? So this takes full account of resource availability, including how many hours they work, how many days each week they work, and their personal as well as public holidays. So we can see with a quick glance at a percentage value, has that resource got too much work for this week? Do I need to do something about that using the corrective actions you can see in front of you? Finally, what we can also do is we can track actual hours for future project predictions. So what that means is that in terms of resource management, we can plan as much as possible, we can take into account as many factors as we can think of, but that still doesn't mean it will always go correctly. So by tracking actual hours over estimated hours, that can help us for our planning in the future. So in summary, resource management enables you to communicate accurately back to the business the time and budget required for a project and to manage that project on a day-to-day basis. So let's look at the principles in terms of how this is achieved within Qualify. So at a high level, each resource is assigned to a country. So for example, I would be assigned to the UK, and the UK has a standard set of working days and working hours. So for our purposes, let's assume 5 days a week, 7 hours a day. The country also contains default public holidays, so bank holidays that everyone has access to. Now, in addition to that, a resource will also hold any personal holidays, plus any overrides to the country's values. So, for example, I might just work 3 days a week, 5 hours a day. that can also be built into the system, because the whole principle of resource management is based upon the fact that we know how many hours or even minutes a day each resource can dedicate to a project. Now, resource management in our terms is represented in two ways. It's represented by role and by resource. So let's take the example of a role. Might be somebody who belongs to QA, or alternatively it could be somebody who belongs to the development team. Okay. Now, role-based entities tend to be higher level planning entities, perhaps such as a requirement. So for example, I estimate that when I'm developing the new order entry system, it will take 4 man-weeks of development. We have 2 testers, however, available in 2 weeks, and therefore I need to assign 2 developers so that we can get that job done in the next 2 weeks. We are effectively planning time slots at a higher level. And for these calculations, the role will use the country values in terms of working hours, working days and public holidays of whoever the system administrator is to work all of that out. Now, a resource-based entity might be something more akin to a task, where you assign specific resources to an activity and you can book time against those tasks for a resource. So you can track the progress of your project or your projects to see how it's going. And I keep mentioning projects. Some people don't work in a project-based system and some people do. Both is fine. If you do work at a project level, you can see your resource management information for a specific project only, or you can look overall at all projects, which is equally as important. Now, in terms of specifics as to how we set this up, this slide is really designed for people who are already familiar with Qualify, and it's just to point out that the resource and country maintenance has moved. It used to be in the Qualify administration area, but it's now where you can see on screen. If you click on management and go to the administration view and resources area, that's where you will find it. And the grids there operate like any ordinary Qualify grid, so it should be easy to find your way around. And finally, a slightly scary screen, but don't worry about this. I'm just going to use it to explain what you need in order to set this up. So for your resource and role-based entities, there are 4 properties that you must have. You must have a role or a resource on there, so we know who to allocate the item to. You must have a duration, so we know when it needs to be performed. A new type of integer property called time, which will give the current estimate, and you can put those figures in hours or in minutes even to define how long a particular item should take. And finally, a status value, which must be fully defined with open and closed values, so we know when something has been completed. Then there are a couple of other optional properties which I will go on to explain when I show you the demo. And in terms of tracking time for your resources, you need an entity which has the 3 values there. Again, it needs a role or a resource, the date that that activity took place, and how long you dedicated to it. That's to track progress against a specific task. Now, it's important to point out that if you haven't got this set up correctly, the resource management button, which I'll go on to show you in a moment, will not appear. However, the diagnostics in Qualify will tell you exactly what you need to do in order to set this up. So let's move on to showing you some of this in action. What you can see in front of you now is the resource management's high-level option, which I got to by clicking on the resource management button in the toolbar. At the moment, I'm looking at resource management across all projects. We will come on to the alternative a little bit later. Let me explain what we're looking at. Please focus on the grid at the top for the moment. This is resource management by role. So this is the role-based entities used for planning rather than detailed progress tracking. At the bottom we have the information by resource, and I'll come on to talk about that in a moment. So the first thing you will notice on the top screen is that going horizontally across the screen, we have information split into weekly columns. So everything is organized on a week-by-week basis. Then on the left-hand side, we have our requirements separated by role. So we can see all of the requirements allocated to development and all of those allocated to QA. Now by default, we will start at this week, but you can use the scroll bar to move left into the past or right into the future. The next thing that we notice is that there are a multitude of colours on this screen. So blue, where we've got the 14 hours and the 21 hours in the week starting the 15th of June, that is time that has already been completed, i.e. that's in the past. Because of the durations of those requirements, they should have already been completed. Therefore, their allocations are in the past and they're in blue, so we know that they're done. If you want to, you can use the filter on these grids to filter out any items, requirements or tasks that have actually been completed so that they don't show on your screen. Now the information in yellow is time yet to be completed or tasks yet to be completed. So for example, in the role of developer, we have a requirement called develop new screens, and that has 42 hours allocated to this week, and because it's current, it's in yellow. Now let's look at how this has been worked out. If I open up that requirement, what I can start to see is some of the properties that I've been speaking about. So I have a status, which is an open status of in development. I have my total duration, and I have my role, which controls who this task or requirement is allocated to. Now what I can see here is I have a current estimate of 21 hours. However, I've got a role multiplier of 2. This is one of these optional properties which is saying that actually I want 2 developers on this requirement. I want to get it done quickly, so 2 developers at 21 hours each. They work 7 hours a day, so that's 42 hours or 6 days in total. Now what I can also see are some figures at the bottom of that column. If I look at the QA role, and where you can see my cursor moving at the bottom of the week of the 29th of June, I have a figure of 2.6 outside the bracket, and that is an average for the week. That is telling me that I need, on average, 2.6 people in the QA role to complete that activity this week. The figure inside the bracket, the maximum of 3, is telling me that on any one given day, the maximum people I need is 3. So to look at another example, it could be that on average, I only need 2 people for the whole week. However, because some tasks start and finish on Friday, I actually need 5 people on that Friday. So in this example, you would see a 2 outside of the brackets and 5 inside to say on average it's 2 people, but there is a day at least when you need much more than that, and you have to ensure that you have that resource available. Now finally, for this grid, we can see noticeably that some of the data is in red. Now red means danger. Red means that you are in danger of not completing that item in time. And by hovering over either the date or the figure in red, it will tell you exactly what's wrong. And it's saying to me that I have 6 hours that I cannot get done in time. So I have 34 hours allocated during the week of the 13th of July. However, because this task finishes on the 14th of July, I only have 2 days in that week to complete it, which will leave me with a total of 6 hours outstanding. And this is where I might need to look at some of those corrective measures that we looked at on the slide. Changing the date might not be a possibility, but perhaps changing that role multiplier and getting some additional QA resource on the Monday would be the way to solve it. that's when I might need to start looking at the bottom grid to see who else I've got available and how many resources I can reallocate. So in summary, the resource management by role is a high-level planning tool. You're not looking at specific resources, you're looking at roles and how many people in specific roles do I need to achieve my deadlines. So let's move on to the bottom grid then, and this is where we are looking at data by resource. Now in my model here, let's just talk a bit about how this is set up. I do have projects at the high level, and as I said, we will look at data by project a little bit later on. Then within a project, I have my requirements defined. That's what we've looked at so far. Within that, I have two types of activity, my development task and my testing task, and they both appear in this resources grid at the bottom. The same principles apply as in the roles grid, so any data that is, any time that has already been completed will appear in blue. So anything in the past appears in blue in its weekly column. But what you'll notice here, which is slightly different, is the current week is split. It has some data in blue and it has some in yellow. Now what that means is that this resource has already booked some time against that task for this week, in this case 4 hours. So if I open this, I will see that I have my time entity attached to my task, and I have already booked 4 hours for this week. So that is then taken off of my calculations as to how much time remaining I have to work. Now if you do want to ask somebody else to help you out with this, you can, because although that task is allocated to me, it doesn't mean that somebody else can't book time against it. So that is one way of dealing with overrunning tasks. One thing we also notice with this task is we also have 1 hour appearing there in red. So this is saying that my deadline date of the 30th of June has now passed. I have booked 4 hours against this task, but I have 1 hour remaining because if I look at the task details, I can see that my testing estimate was 5 hours. Now let's assume that this is a slightly atypical example where we have overestimated our time. So actually it is complete and it did only take us 4 hours. So this is where you might want to feed back to the business the time that was saved, and we could track this using an additional property which we can summarize a report to say actually we saved or indeed we overestimated a certain amount of time on this project. Now what might be more typical is that this resource simply did not have enough time in that week to complete all tasks. And this is certainly true in this scenario because we can see that resource Sarah Ponsford has an allocation during this week of 117%. Now we would expect no more than 100% because that means that the number of hours I work exactly matches the number of hours of activity that have been allocated to me. And that's why that's in red, because I do not have enough time to complete the tasks that are assigned to me. So what are my options for dealing with this? Well, we may laugh, but one option is to actually work some overtime. That is a perfectly valid way of dealing with this deficit. And there is no reason that although this task of order entry by customer number needs 5 hours spent on it, there is no reason that I can't spend more on it this week and more on the other task. That will get worked out in the calculations. So that is one option. Obviously another option is to reallocate some of my tasks to an underutilized resource. Now I can see at the bottom of the screen that resource Adrian Rogers only has an allocation currently of 74%. So another valid action or corrective measure would be to open one of these tasks and reallocate it to Adrian Rogers. Finally, we could change the end date or extend the end date of some of these tasks. Now, typically that's not something you would want to do. However, I might decide that my order inquiry, it's a cosmetic display of data. It's not as important as getting the order entry right, and therefore I could move it to later on in the testing cycle. So if I choose to extend the date, that means that those hours could be worked in the following week. That puts my allocation back to the ideal 100%. Now, what this is showing me is an over-allocation or an under-allocation of a resource. Obviously, that could happen for all sorts of reasons. It could be that I've just spent longer on some tasks than we estimated. It could be that I've had an unexpected commitment outside of work and I haven't been able to work all my hours. The resource information will tell you that, but what this is showing you is the impacts of any changes and where we need to take action by changing something so that we can still meet our deadline dates and achieve our project goals. Now, finally, there is something else that we can do to achieve our project in the most desirable way. So at the moment, this task of order entry by customer number is still showing in red. It's telling me that it needs 5 hours, but actually at the end of the week, I will still have 3 hours remaining. That's because it needs to be finished today, and I can't bump it through to tomorrow. Now, I know that this is my most important task. The one above it, the cash register screen flow, that belongs to a different project which has a future deadline date, and I would rather work on order entry in preference. Now, by default, they're all treated with the same priority, and they will simply be addressed in the sequence that you see, which is why the cash register screen flow is being worked on first. What I can do, however, is I can use the optional priority property to say this has a higher priority than my other tasks, and therefore I want to complete this one first. What then happens is I know that my order entry is going to get completed, and my cash register screen flow is the one that might have to move into tomorrow or to next week. And as I say, just to reiterate, I'm working in hours at the moment, but this can go down to the more granular level of minutes if you have much smaller tasks to complete. Now, something else that we can do is we can view this data side by side in a timeline view, which might be very useful if you're trying to get a more graphical perspective of some of these tasks. It will be easier if I do this to just work with my own data, so I'm going to change the filter to work just with my data, and I'm going to bring in my planned tasks. And I will just show you how easy it is to set up a view with this data. Because it's a timeline, it'll be much easier if it's at the bottom. So what you now have are two views on exactly the same data. So at the top I have my allocations, and that's indicating to me where my problem areas are. At the bottom I have the timeline easily modifiable view of my planned in data. So if we look at this cash register screen flow, I can find this down here, it's this task here, and I can say, okay, I am going to bump that into the following week because I know that won't matter. So by dragging and dropping that into the following week, you can see it changes the display above. That's no longer in red, and I have resolved my allocation issues. Now, the very last thing I'd like to show you is how you can look at resource management by project. This view we're looking at now is the overall resource management model in your system. And that's invaluable if, for example, let's say you were working on an ERP upgrade, but the team also working on that were also working on a specific customer enhancement, or perhaps several of those. They are therefore spread across projects, and it's really important to see that Otherwise, you might think that resource has availability when they're actually committed somewhere else. However, you also might work with a project system where teams are dedicated to a specific project, where they do not have commitments outside of that. And in that example, seeing your resource information by project is incredibly useful. So you can see it as a child of your project or a requirement or whatever other items you choose to use. So for example, these are all my resource allocations for my order entry process. Equally, I can look at them for a specific customer change request. So depending on how you work and what view you need, you can drill down to exactly the kind of data you need. You can see overall resource management allocations. You can drill down into a particular project, particular resource. You can make adjustments necessary to ensure that you do achieve all of your project goals. So that concludes the demonstration part of today. Hopefully I've shown those who already use Qualify a flavour of the extension of that functionality and given you an idea of how you can begin to set that up. Obviously, we are always happy to help you to do that. If you have any questions at all, please do contact us. If you're not current Qualify users, please do also get in touch, because Qualify is not only a great resource management and project planning solution, it unites all aspects of the software quality lifecycle from requirements right through to deployment, providing an integrated approach to solving a quality process and management challenges, and we would be happy to show you some of that. So at this point, we would be happy to take any of your questions, and I will hand back over to Maria to see if anybody has anything they would like to know.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's kickstart with one question that appeared during the session. Is it possible to exchange data and or interface with other calendars and or planning tools, for example, Outlook, Notes, Microsoft Project, Jira, Mylin, etc.?
Well, Qualify has lots of capabilities for importing data into its systems. So if you have data outside of Qualify that you would like to bring in and display in a resource management framework, then that is possible. We do also have integrations with other tools such as Jira and TFS. However, we don't currently integrate on a dynamic basis with things like Outlook, but that's not to say that won't be possible in the future.
Thank you, Sarah. Next question. Are there any additional licenses required for resource management?
No, there are not. At the moment, this is covered within your existing Qualify licensing. So if you have a user license for Qualify, then you will have access to these capabilities.
Okay. Hoping that our delegates can hear Sarah, because I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Please raise your hand if you are getting feedback. A few more questions are coming in. So next question. We don't work on projects as such, we work on ad hoc basis. How does that fit into resource management area?
That is fine. We have capabilities built in, as I showed you, to work within a project, but that is certainly not necessary. You have the overall resource management views, which will allow you to see everything, whether it's based within a project or not. So we can work in both ways.
Okay, so we've got two questions merged into one here. How can you create Scrum Team resource management, something like Agile resource management?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but let me try and talk about that in general terms. One of the things that we also have in Qualify is a card view. Now, I'm not sure if you would have seen that, but any grid can be viewed in cards, which is intended to emulate the agile views where you can move items from one status to another. So that might be something that would be applicable there. In terms of resource management specifically, there is no reason that this couldn't be used in an agile environment. I would suggest that you probably would want to use the planner view so that you can use drag and drop between resources and between statuses in order to achieve that more agile goal.
Thank you. Another question here. Can the project data be exported into a report to feedback to my manager?
Absolutely, yes. In resource management, we have various methods of exporting data. We can export to a spreadsheet so data can be manipulated, or we can literally create a printout of the data that you see in front of you. So yes, that can definitely be achieved.
Okay. That's the main scope of the questions that have come through. Would anyone else like to ask a question before we end the session shortly? If you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. You can get in touch via solutions@orisoft.com or go to orisoft.com/contact with a full list of contact details there. And like Cyrus said, those that are not using Qualify, like to have a better look, please do get in touch and we can have a proper one-to-one session on that with you. Okay, I think we're going to close out the webinar today. Thank you very much, Sarah. Oh, sorry, no, we've just got a last-minute question I think worth asking before we close out. Yes, Linda, will this webinar be available as a video to review later? Yes, it will. We've recorded this session and by Monday you all should receive an email with a link to this recording and these PowerPoint slides to share with your team members as well. So, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to our delegates for joining us today.